So today we're going to be making these delicious bacon, mozzarella, and basil paninis. And they're Parmesan crusted, which is actually the best part. It's kind of like Parmesan candy if you can picture that. And this is also a great recipe if you have homegrown tomatoes because this tomato basil salad goes perfect with this. And I'm going to be making these things inside of a sandwich press, but if you don't have one of those, it's not a big deal. I came up with another method that also works great, and I'll be including that within this video. So let's get to it. So the first thing we need to do is get our bacon ready, and the best way to cook bacon is on a sheet tray in the oven. It cooks evenly, it maintains its shape, it doesn't create a mess on the stovetop, and you can cook a lot at one time. And I also want to point out that not all bacon packages are the same, but they all do cost the same, so it is worth rummaging through and finding one that has a better meat to fat ratio, kind of like what you see here. And once you get your pan situated, place it into a preheated 375-degree oven. Okay, this bacon has to cook in the oven for about 20 minutes now, so let's go over a few specifications on some of the other ingredients that I'm going to be using in this recipe. Okay, first up we've got bread, and I'm going to be using this Italian loaf that I picked up at Aldi. And what I like about this stuff is that it's not pre-sliced, so I can slice it however thick I prefer it. And what you also want to look for is a bread that's sturdy enough to hold up to the weight of the Panini Press. So that means for the most part stay away from the bread aisle and gear your search more towards the bakery section. Next up we've got mozzarella cheese, of which there are two types. There's the traditional fresh style mozzarella, and then there's the American style low moisture mozzarella. Now both of these will work just fine, but I personally prefer the low moisture mozzarella because it's less likely to seep out and make the sandwich soggy. But if you do want to use this stuff, maybe pat it dry with paper towels before putting the sandwich together. You could also use provolone cheese, which is the same type of cheese as mozzarella, and these cheeses are known as pasta filata cheeses, which literally translates to spun curds or spun paste. And during manufacturing, these cheeses are dunked into hot water, and then they're stretched and kneaded like bread dough after that, and then they're formed into various shapes like logs or spheres, which sometimes you run into at the store. Okay, now that the bacon is all finished up, I want to point out that the bacon should be crispy, but it should not be cooked to the point that it becomes bitter. I feel the need to point that out because there is way too much overcooking of bacon going on in the world. Okay, moving on from that, let's get the rest of our sandwich components put together. So start by grating a decent amount of Parmesan cheese with the largest side of your box grater. Make sure you have enough here because once the cooking starts, the process goes fast, so backtracking really isn't an option. And now that we've got that out of the way, we can put together our tomato basil side salad or condiment, whatever you prefer to call it. Start by removing the core of a tomato, preferably a homegrown one, and dice it into chunks that are somewhere in the range of a ½ inch thick. Place them into a mixing bowl and follow that up by rolling together a few basil leaves and giving them a rough chop. Add those to the same mixing bowl along with a few pinches of salt and a few splashes of balsamic vinegar. Give the whole thing a stir and set that aside, and let's get our sandwiches assembled. Starting with the bread, I've sliced it roughly 3/4 of an inch thick, and that's to account for the fact that the Panini Press is going to compress the sandwich a little bit. And the assembly portion of this is fairly simple. Place a few bacon pieces onto 1/2 of the bread slices, followed up by a few basil leaves on top of each one, and finally finish with some relatively thick cut mozzarella on top. Close them up with the remaining bread, and we're ready to cook these things. Start by setting your sandwich press between medium and high heat, and once it heats up, add a layer of Parmesan cheese to the bottom, and make sure it extends past where the sandwiches will be situated because that's how you get the crisp edges. Place a few sandwiches on top of the cheese and add another layer of Parmesan cheese onto the top side of the sandwiches. Close the press, and this only takes a minute or two to cook these things, so don't walk away. And when you get to the point that the cheese on the bottom side is lightly browned and bubbly, grab a spatula and carefully separate the top layer of cheese from the press. This is somewhat of a delicate process to make sure that the cheese clings to the bread and not to the press. Okay, I'm going to transfer these to a cutting board, but before plating everything up, let's quickly go over an alternative method. Place a nonstick pan over medium heat and add a bit of Parmesan cheese to the bottom of the pan. Place a sandwich on top, and once the cheese melts and fuses itself to the bottom, carefully pull the sandwich out and repeat the process on the other side. I wouldn't try to simulate a panini press with two pans because things would likely fall apart, and you can see here that doing it this way makes for a more than acceptable substitute. Alright, jumping back over to the cutting board, let's get this thing plated up. I'll start by splitting the two sandwiches apart and cut each one into two sections, and I wanted to sort of shingle them for the thumbnail picture, but the Parmesan crust didn't really cooperate with that idea, so I ended up just stacking them. I've placed a small amount of the tomato basil condiment into a ramekin to add to the plate, and that's it for this dish. I hope you enjoyed the video, and as always, thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.